Hi, and thanks for checking out Next Level Carpentry. I'm kind of excited about this video because I want to introduce you to Tsumiki. I think I'm pronouncing that right. You saw it spelled in the thumbnail. It's something that I found out about over the Thanksgiving weekend. A viewer commented about making building blocks for grandkids. I apologize to the viewer because I don't remember which message was yours. I got off on a rabbit trail and came across these building blocks. Basically, they call them the Japanese version of Legos. They're a product of a Japanese architect named Kengo Kuma, if I got that right. And this is his idea of a stackable block. This is what they look like, and they're modular so that they can be arranged in all sorts of different configurations, from the simple little structure here to animals and towers and all sorts of cool sculptures. But anyways, I spent the Thanksgiving weekend, it was a blizzard outside, so I spent it in the shop, nice and cozy, making up a batch of these Tsumiki blocks. And it was so much fun, and with Christmas coming and possible gifts for eclectic grandkids or curious adults, I wanted to do a video to show how I made these. I made a batch of fixtures over here, and each one of these fixtures is used for making or modifying all the parts that it takes to make these blocks. I made a batch of about 30 from some scrap material and designed these fixtures to safely make these parts and be able to make them efficiently so I could mass produce these. So for the video, you'll see how I use these fixtures. Various ones. This one cuts the splines in the top. This one cuts a sharp angle. This one is for assembly. This one does some planing to shorten up the sanding process. And here's another one for notching. I'm not going to go into great detail about how each of the individual fixtures is made. That's a separate video in itself. If there's questions, I may try to address some of those in a future video. I will show a close-up video and a few still shots of the jigs so you can see how they're set up. I don't really have plans for these, but if you watch the video, you'll see the dimensions I use. Because they're modular, I just picked some common numbers that work really well. There may be some technical proportions that are more accurate to the original Kengo Kuma design, but these work great. There's a couple little features that showed up by serendipity in this in the design and the proportions that I used for these. But the goal of the video is to show with some fixtures how these can be made quickly, accurately, and safely. I'm going to throw one more little twist into this video. Get my little tower down here so it doesn't crash to the shop floor. But because the size of these parts, the main part is just one of the legs. They're about 4.5 inches long, 2 inches wide, and I made mine 5/16 of an inch thick. You can do a metric conversion if you like, in honor of the designer. But because of the shape of the material, they're ideal for making out of pallet wood. The fact that some pallets come in exotic woods just makes the final product a little cooler. This was maple from one of the perfect pallets I got. There's a little bit of spalting on some of the pieces. I thought that was kind of a nice little feature. But I literally went out and dug through a 4-foot snowdrift to get a pallet to use for the batch of these blocks that we'll make in the video. This is what the pallet for this project looked like after I dug it out of the snowdrift, brought it home, and stood it in the shop where it could thaw out. Doesn't look very promising at this stage. And here's the pallet again. It's had 24 hours to dry on the outside. The wood is really dry. It had surface moisture, but the internal moisture is all gone out of this. The wood is nice and dry, so I'm not concerned about it misbehaving when it's being worked on, making these small parts. I'm the first to admit that this pallet still doesn't look very promising at this stage of the game, but I'm confident that it's got good wood in it, and I won't be wasting time making a bunch of parts out of this wood. And the reason I'm confident is because I picked this up from a stack of pallets behind a local store that does a lot of importing, and I've seen their pallets before. This one is some sort of mahogany, as near as I can tell, even though this uniform gray look doesn't look very encouraging. But here's a little tip for anybody that's out pallet shopping. I just take a utility knife with me when I go looking, and whether the wood's wet or dry, I can use that utility knife to pare away the edges to see what the wood looks like inside. This looks like a nice brown mahogany. A couple of these have a red cast to them. There's a nice rich red one there. And with a quick assessment like that, I know it's going to be worth my while to take this home, dry it out, and then go about milling it into parts. There's a link to another video here I did called Search for a Perfect Pallet, where I got some pallets that were pretty beefy and robust. But this pallet here is a pretty scrawny thing. There's no big pieces in it. It's just these little slats, and there's a million nails in there, and all the nails are cinched over. So rather than debone this pallet, I'm just going to fillet it and get the pieces of wood out that I can use. And that's going to be the slats in between here. This is about 16 inches long. Those pieces are 4.5, so I should be able to get 3 little pieces out of each segment here. If I cut this whole pallet up, I should end up with about 60 little pieces and enough for 30 Tsumiki blocks. So that's the goal, which makes me thankful because I'm able to use this beautiful wood that's in this pallet that otherwise is just going to end up as compost. Filleting a pallet is not unlike filleting a fish. I'm after the good chunks of meat with very little work, and I'm just going to recycle all the bones. I'm using my favorite Makita cordless brushless saw. It's 18-volt lithium-ion batteries. Thing cuts like a dream. I set the blade just deep enough to cut through the thickest slats and then cut along fairly close to the nail heads. And that yields the longest usable pieces that I'll mill down. And by looking at the cut ends of these pieces, you can see that I've got some really rich color in here and a wide range of shades, which should make for some pretty attractive little blocks. I'll set my blade just a little bit deeper for the next batch of cuts. And I turned the pallet over and cut a few more little petite fillets off the back of these bottom slats. And one of these, if I didn't know better, I'd say that's Paduke right there. You can see a beautiful orange color, and it came off somewhere on the bottom here. But what remains is nothing but pallet bones, all full of nails and splits. But at least the volume of wood that doesn't get repurposed is about half or less than what I started out with. In the course of their life, pallets get drug around on dirt and on concrete and asphalt, and so they can get a lot of grit and dirt embedded into them. These are pretty clean, so I'm not too worried about it, but I'm also not going to put brand new planer knives in before I start the process, because there's bound to be some sand in here, so I can get this all milled down without too much worry about trashing equipment from dirty wood. If I'm concerned about it, I'd take this metal tug brush and just scrub the wood and pull the sand and dirt out of it. Like I said, this stuff is pretty clean, so I'm just going to hit it with the joiner and start the cleanup process. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the milling process. Basically, I'm just taking these random width, rough pieces of wood. I'll joint the best edge straight and then rip them to about 2 1/4 inches wide, flatten a face, thickness plane a face till I get it down to 5/16, and then I'll go through and dial the width in so they're all at 2 inches. So I've got pieces that are 5/16 of an inch thick exactly and 2 inches wide. Because this is tropical wood, I want to minimize the amount of potential dust in the air, so I'm hooking up my Gyro Air G700 dust processor by Harvey Industries, which does a great job of capturing 99.9% of the dust generated by milling these pieces. As an aside, Harvey Industries has a great promotional sale price for the G700 dust processor through the month of December 2019. Check out my website at nextlevelcarpentry.shop and get a hold of me for details if you're interested in a sweet machine like this. Milling old, dirty, cast-off wood like this to reveal the beauty that's inside is one of the greatest satisfactions I find in woodworking. Watching the pieces transform from rubbish to heirloom is very gratifying. Because of the variance in thickness from one slat to the next, I choose to resaw them on the table saw to get them closer to their final thickness dimension. I'm using a Freud thin kerf rip blade, which makes quick work of this task. A fresh coat of wax on the bed of my DW735 planer before a job like this helps to ensure a more consistent surface on the wood and minimizes the possibility of snipe. And this is the Johnson's paste wax that I use and recommend for this. I pay attention to make sure that I plane both surfaces of every piece. Some of the pieces are a little thin and won't get planed down to the 5/16 finish thickness, but I'll just cut those off as scrap later. Once both surfaces are flat, I'll run them through the thickness planer to smooth out the surfaces and minimize sanding later, and to get them to a consistent thickness of 5/16 of an inch. I make sure to run both top and bottom surfaces through the thickness planer. That way both surfaces have the fine finish of the thickness planer compared to the coarser finish from the joiner, which I run at a faster rate. Once all the pieces are milled down to a uniform 5/16 inch thickness, I sort through them and choose the best edge for a final straightening, and then another rip for a consistent width. Then I joint the good edge and, paying attention to everything, rip off the less favorable edge. I dial the table saw in to just under 2 1/16 inches. That way I can make 2 passes through the thickness planer, which in this case is a widthness planer, taking a skinny 32nd inch off of each edge for a perfectly milled finished surface. To keep track of the edges, I stack all the pieces on edge and scribe diagonal crosshatch marks on one edge, then flip them over and put perpendicular crosshatch marks on the other edges. I run the pieces through the thickness planer to plane off all the diagonal marks, and then flip the pieces over and plane off all the perpendicular marks, and I know I'm done. And once I'm done doing the fourth side for the final pass on all these pieces, I now have a whole stack of pellet wood processed down into strips that are identical in width and thickness. They're 2 inches wide and 5/16 of an inch thick. And now the fun begins, because I'll start using those fixtures to turn all these slats into Tsumiki parts. First thing I'm going to do is to cut the legs to length. These come out exactly 4 inches from the top point to the short point here. That's exactly 4. There's a little heel on here, whatever you want to call that. Adds a little bit of length. They're just a little less than 4 1/4 inches for this configuration. So I want to rough cut these legs to about 4 1/2 inches, and then I'll trim them to precise length later on. The way these are, I want the show face to be on the outside, so I want the show face to be on the short point face here, which means the show face gets looked at this way. This is the finished face that goes in this fixture like this. And all this little fixture does, it's just a couple pieces of wood. This one's cut at a 30-degree angle so that there's an included angle of 60 degrees, which is the angle of these blocks. I want the show face to be out here. This helps me line these up so that I can gang cut them to that 30 degrees and have the show face on the outside of the block. Hope that makes sense. So now I just pick the best end of each piece and then the best face of the best end to put on the outside. I think I'm going to put a little character there. And each one of these will be a little different orientation. I'm not going to get exactly 3 blocks out of each piece. There's a split on this end. So I'm just going to start at this end, and I want that to be the show face. I just go through the same quick thought process with each piece, line these up and decide how I'm going to cut them. You get the general idea, and I'll do these blocks, about 10 at a time with this little fixture. And all this does is kind of line those ends up at a 30-degree angle, so I minimize the amount of waste when I trim these off. Once I've got 10 of them lined up, I just take a piece of masking tape and cinch them together to hold them at that angle, and a piece on each side keeps this little bundle together. Now I can take them to the miter box 10 at a time and cut a precise angle on the bottom of every piece, all in one quick, precise cut. And I want to keep these as the bottom of the leg so that I know the short point is the show face. So I'm just going to put a couple Sharpie marker lines here. They'll get cut out later, but that way I can always orient these pieces in the same manner as I go through the steps. And now I can add a mark here at 4 1/2 inches, and that'll be the rough length of the pieces. I add a couple more pieces of masking tape so I can continue to cut legs. Keep in mind, these pieces are just cut to rough length, so I'll line up that first cut and just put a mark on the saw table here for the rest of these. And that'll be plenty accurate for now. Some of these pieces are too short to get another piece out of, and I'm going to reevaluate the faces here. You can see how this one's got a bad spot. I might want to flip this one around and reverse it so that I can get a better piece out of it. But that's the process for rough cutting these legs and keeping track of the faces and ends. Well, I think that's an example of how well this can go with a simple alignment fixture. Gang cutting with masking tape. There's a video here that I talk about using that process, but with that little bit of effort, I've got 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 87 Tsumiki leg blocks, all just like that. This would probably take about less than 15 minutes if I wasn't shooting video. So with all these parts ready and marked for the bottom side, like this, the next step is going to be to cut that V-notch in the bottom. There's a bit of a trick to that. So stick around. And if you like what you're seeing in this video so far, I'd appreciate it if you take a second and hit that thumbs up button while you're thinking about it. And while you're at it, consider subscribing to Next Level Carpentry if you haven't already. It's free, you know, and you'll be notified each time a new video like this is uploaded instead of just having to wait for random access to videos in the What to Watch Next playlist. Thanks for taking a second to do that. Now I'm going to get back to work. In my opinion, cutting this notch for the bottom of these legs is the crux of this whole woodworking project. When I first saw these blocks, I thought, well, I can make those. That shouldn't be too bad. Then I got to thinking about the geometry and what's really going on, and I kind of backed myself into a mental corner trying to figure it out. Let me explain. The blocks are based on an equilateral triangle, so each corner is 120 degrees. There's two 60-degree angles that come together for each one of those. So this point here has an included angle of 60 degrees. So the notch has to fit that included angle. And you can also see that the notch is very pointed in the middle here. And if you think about it, when you put a saw blade at a 30-degree angle, the teeth are at 90 degrees to the face of the blade, so they won't cut a perfectly sharp 60-degree corner. They'll cut a perfectly sharp 90-degree corner, but not a 60. So the trick was to come up with a precise and fast way of cutting a 60-degree notch in here with a very sharp point in the corner so that the legs fit precisely on top of the points. And there's another subtle difference here to complicate things. Notice that the 60-degree notch needs to go through the block at a 30-degree angle, or it doesn't fit right. So not only do I have to make a sharp 60-degree notch through the leg, it has to travel at a 30-degree angle in relation to the face. So I'll show you the jig I came up with for making that little cut, and then a little added trick to get it done the way it needs to be. Explaining the difficulty of cutting this notch is a little bit confusing, but here goes. First off, I've got the blade set at a 30-degree angle from vertical to make the side cut of this notch. But I can't use a regular rip fence and push this block through here with the piece at 90 degrees because then the angle won't follow through the block at the required 30-degree angle. So to solve that problem, I made this special adapter block that goes on a rip fence, and it holds the piece in at 30 degrees off of vertical. So the cut will be made with that compound angle, taking the notch through the block at 30 degrees. So that's one problem solved. The next problem comes up when I go to cut the mirror image on the other side of this leg. I can't just flip the block around and cut it using the same fixture because the relative angle is wrong and the notch wouldn't come out the way it needs to. So to solve that problem, I made this little flip block that drops down and it reverses this angle that's 30 degrees off of 90 to 30 degrees off 90 the other way. So I can just make a cut for one leg, flip the block down, flip the leg around, and make a cut the other direction. And to keep everything lined up, I bring the rib fence in so it just skims along the face of this block. That way this block pivots down right where it needs to, and when I switch this block around side to side, it holds everything in place and makes the second side of that cut. And I hope that's pretty clear. I'll mention here and now that these blocks, like you know, they're 2 inches wide, 5/16 of an inch thick, and these are 30-degree angles. But the dimension here on this shoulder, on the leg, from the edge to the start of the V-notch is exactly 1/2 inch, and The one on the other side is symmetrical at a 1/2 inch, so that leaves a 1 inch space in the middle. That's right on this shoulder, not on the underside on these long points, because those dimensions change. So I hope you can see that with this setup, I can get the bulk of this notch made, but I still have a lingering issue about getting that sharp point in this 60-degree notch. And I'll show you how I solve that after I gang cut the V-notch in the bottom of all my leg bundles. And take note of the orientation of the leg as it's being cut. This is how the leg is positioned, so the cut needs to go through just like that. And notice that the long point of the cut is on the table, not the short point like this. This would make the V go through at the opposite angle. And what that means is, even though I've got these blocks marked for the bottom of the legs, I can't really make the cut this way because the cut would be backwards. I need to switch the orientation of that angle, so all these blocks have to tilt 60 degrees in the opposite direction before the cuts are made. I know, confusing, right? So to reorient these blocks, I go back to this 60-degree alignment fixture, just break the masking tape on these bundles, and keep in mind at the end with the Sharpie marks are the bottoms of the legs. I just re-index these pieces in this fixture, and it switches the orientation of the legs from this direction, where the short points line up, to this direction where all the long points line up. And once all those long points are lined up and touching, I go back with a piece of masking tape and rebundle them nice and snug so they stay in perfect alignment. I flip them over and do the other side, just like that. So now the long points are all oriented the right way, like this. The angle of the cut goes through like this. And this might help visualize a little bit. If I take a finished block, put it up next to the fence and slide it past the blade, you can see how the blade is going to make that cut. When I flip it around, it does the same thing. So when I'm using my fence with this flip block, it's essentially taking the leg from this orientation and then switching it to that orientation as that notch is made. I found it's a little more steady to make the cut in this direction first with the fence flipped here. My hand is on top of the rip fence. I'm guiding with the push block as I go through the blade, and I'm mindful that the blade is going to exit behind this rip fence when everything comes out. But this is what it looks like in practice. And that's all there is to it. Perfectly cut notches. These little cutout pieces are pretty cool in themselves. Maybe those are mini Tsumiki blocks for somebody to play with. But now you can see the last part of the crux of this problem. There's this little tooth stuck in the middle of those legs. Can you see that? Maybe this shows it up better. And with that in there, this leg won't fit over the peak of the block below it. So I got to get that little chunk of wood out of there, and I want to do it quickly, cleanly, and accurately. And brainstorming through a little predicament like getting that notch out of there quickly and cleanly is the kind of thing that puts me to sleep at night. My brain goes to work trying to figure out how I can get that done. I envision using a router bit, but this is kind of a deep reach for a router bit, and then it would have to be a 60-degree point and not a 45. I could probably get that, but I didn't really like the idea of that setup following through very cleanly or quickly. But I suppose if I was going into production on these on a grand scale, I might look into something like that. But as it is, I ended up with something that was just plain old simple and easy. So naturally, that's what I decided to go with. And I think the proper term for a solution this quick and easy is appropriately called stupid simple. I just take a batch of these blocks, still taped together right off the table saw, clamp them in the vise, and then cutting this direction against the angle with a sharp snap blade knife. I found that with a sufficient number of passes with a sharp knife, I can cut that little extra V out of the middle of these blocks in fairly short order. And the resultant V fits perfectly on the top points of adjacent pieces. It's no harder than that. As promised, here's a close-up of the leg V-notch cutting fixture. I put a flat piece on a miter fence, and I took a block that's pretty thick and wider than the legs and cut a 30-degree angle on one face. The block is true and square, rides up against the fence, and it holds the blade so that it cuts a ½ inch in from this edge of the leg. So that's how it's set next to the rib fence to index that cut side to side. This piece is just another chunk of the same block cut with two 30-degree angles so the leg can be flipped for the opposite cut. And because the legs are symmetrical, the cut is indexed off the fence and it makes it the same on both faces. I used a piece of tough electrical tape as a hinge for this block. That works really well. There's not a lot of force on it. And it's also the reason why I'm gang cutting these blocks. I haven't reoriented these yet, but having 10 of them together just keeps everything stable as it's passing through the blade. A person could put a permanent attachment for this block and screw it on or off in between the cuts. That would be one thing. And an escape block on the back side of the fence for when the blade comes out after the cut's made wouldn't be a bad idea either. And I hope that's enough detail about this fixture so anyone that's inclined to make these blocks could replicate the fixture and come up with the same cuts that I did. Please add any extra safety features or disregard the process completely if you're not comfortable with the manner that this works. Well, thanks for bearing with me. I think you can understand why I saw this as the crux of the project. But with the compound angle cuts and cleaning out that V-notch problem solved, the rest of the build is pretty routine. I made a couple quick 30-degree cuts on the end of a 2x6 to create a 60-degree V-block for sanding the space between the Tsumiki legs while they're still bundled and clamped in the vise. And a few quick swipes with a 120 grit sanding screen smooths these up nice in a hurry. With a safe and efficient setup, it doesn't take long to put identical notches in the bottom of each of these 87 legs. And with a mass production process like this, something as insignificant as a 60-degree sanding block to sand these all at once is a great time leverage, getting all that sanding done in just a few minutes instead of easily over an hour if they were done individually. And here's something to think about when you're working on an intricate project like this. At the same time we were notching 87 legs with a perfect V-notch, we were also creating 87 identical cutoff pieces, these scraps. And each one is identical. They have very precise angles on them, but they're just the scrap. And I think these little scraps are pretty amazing in their own right. Can't imagine what some clever kid in an art or sculpture class would do with blocks like this. But if you reverse your thinking a little bit and you ever find yourself confronted with the task of making a piece that looks like this, now you have a pretty good idea how to go about it with a similar setup. And then in that case, these would be the scrap. Something to think about. So after I go through all these pieces and get them caught up to that first batch, I'll jump into the next step, which is going to be cutting the sharp angle on the top of this. It's an included angle of 30 degrees, which is beyond the normal 45-degree angle capability of table saws. And it would be a tricky and somewhat dangerous cut to do on a miter saw. So I'll show you the fixture I made to get that done quickly and accurately. Next. Remember early in the video I talked about these legs being cut extra long. You can see here that they end up about a ½ inch longer than the finished leg. Depending on how my wood laid out, I guess I could have cut these to 4 1/4 instead of 4 1/2, but in this case it would have just made for bigger scraps, not more legs, so I didn't worry about it. But this also brings me to the coolest part of this project, which is cutting these to length, and I'll show you why. You can see in the finished pieces the sharp angle that needs to be cut on the top of the piece. The included angle of the cut is 30 degrees, which is the reciprocal of 90. Angles sharper than 45 degrees are typically a bit more difficult to cut, and even more so on a small piece like this. Finger safety is of the utmost importance. My older miter box only goes to 45 degrees, although some of the new models will go all the way to 30, and theoretically that cut could be made with the miter box like that, but because the piece is so short, fingers are way too close for comfort. So even if I had a newer miter box, I wouldn't even consider cutting these pieces in that manner. So that takes me back to the table saw for my best option of cutting these pieces. But it doesn't solve all the problems. A straightforward way of cutting a 30-degree angle on the tips of these pieces would be to tilt the blade 30 degrees from vertical, stand the piece on edge, and run it past the blade. That would make the cut, but anyone with table saw experience knows immediately the danger and impracticality of that. The piece wants to get sucked down into the table even with a zero clearance blade insert. These pieces are way too small to handle without injury in an application like that. And generally, when I'm faced with a dilemma like this, I turn to a fixture. A fixture's main job is to keep my fingers safe, and its second job is to cut pieces consistently and accurately. A well-designed fixture does both with ease. And this is the one that I made for this application. The first good thing about this is the blade runs at 90 degrees and not 30. Plus, I can use a zero clearance table saw insert to keep cutoffs from dropping down inside the table and binding up on the blade. And since the blade is running at 90 degrees, I just need to orient the piece to run at 30 degrees to cut off that sharp 30-degree angle by running it past the spinning blade. Yes, folks, that's how a table saw works. A spinning blade cuts wood. Woohoo! With this setup, a challenge arises because I still have to hold the piece firmly, consistently, and accurately. And to compound that, in this case, the blade has to be sticking out of the table over 2.5 inches to make the cut. And that's a scary amount of blade to have spinning very close to your fingers at all. So the purpose of the jig then is to hold the piece accurately for consistent cuts and to keep my fingers far enough away that the spinning blade isn't a danger. This fixture is made with a piece of maple bar stock that fits in my miter gauge slot and just a piece of 1/2 inch MDF, but any decent quality sheet goods will work. A fence here that's as thick as the leg is just screwed to this MDF base. The fence is set precisely at 30 degrees to the blade. A stop block here indexes the piece for length. By slipping it into place, I put mating angles on this so that it nests together here for a firm hold, and that sets a consistent length and a consistent angle for the cut. You can see I've got my favorite push stick handle also screwed to this MDF. That keeps my hand away from the blade, and since I don't want to have a hand over here close to the blade holding the piece in place, I use this push action Destaco clamp to lock the piece down in place. I'm running a blade stabilizer on this blade, and it lifts up the table saw insert when I raise the blade high enough to make this 2-inch cut over a 1/2 inch thick piece of MDF. So I've got to take that stabilizer off to get the reach I need for this cut. I use this forced blade stabilizer to make good cuts even better, but keep in mind that this won't fix a bad table saw. It just makes a good saw better. And to get the smoothest cut without that stabilizer, I just decrease my feed rate and feed pressure and still get a wonderfully smooth cut. But now I have enough blade clearance to cut completely through the piece in one pass. Here's a close-up of the nesting feature of the clamp. I cut this stop block at a 30-degree angle. It's set so that the pieces come out precisely 4 inches from this shoulder to the new tip that gets cut on the piece. If any sawdust or splinters get caught down in that little corner, I can see right here if there's a gap. When I clamp the piece, it's going to come out the wrong length. But as long as this gap is tight, when I set the clamp, I know the piece will come out accurate and precise, just like it's supposed to. And this, folks, is what this looks like in action. I index all my parts in the same orientation, so they go directly from a stack to the fixture for the cut. See that everything on this face is absolutely perfectly flush, lined up, straight as can be. And I can cut these repetitively, quickly, accurately, and most important, safely. With this fixture, my fingers never need to get any closer than 6 inches to the blade. And after 10 cuts or so, I take the offcuts and get them out of the way so they don't tend to fling back at me. I could be wearing a face shield, I suppose. If somebody's got a riving knife, that's fine too. I don't have one. But with the fixture, I'm confident in doing this all day long. I got to stay focused. I can't go and daydream and get the sequence wrong. But other than that, I'll cut 87 of these pieces with no fuss and no worry. And just take an up-close look at the precision of these parts. In any reasonable level of practicality, these pieces are identical. I'll go through and put this sharp point cut on all 87 pieces, and then we'll go to the next step. And to me, this is the joy of woodworking. Come up with a safe and repetitive process for making precision parts. You have the smell of the wood in the shop, the satisfaction of seeing an old pallet turn into something pretty cool, and it's just nice to work with well-tuned precision machines to get consistent results without frustration, aggravation, or surprises. If there's such a thing as living a dream for a woodworker, this is pretty much it. And that right there, folks, is what 86 Tsumiki legs look like when they're all cut and ready for assembly. Well, almost ready for assembly. I've got one little tedious bit of housekeeping to do before going into the assembly process. And that's to sand the inside of the legs and the inside 2 edges. When they're assembled like this, it'd be virtually impossible to get a good sanding job inside there, plus it would take extra time. So I do that step now before they're put together. Unfortunately, if you ask me, there is no fun way for sanding. But to make the best of it, I'll use this zip gator block here. It's my favorite for this sort of stuff. It's got hook and loop pads. I'm using 220 grit. Let's slip on here. And then I just sand each one. Sand the inside face to smooth off any splinters. And just give a slight roll to each of the 2 inside edges. I'm being very careful not to round off this corner here. That needs to be flush when it's glued together. And I don't want to round off this shoulder underneath here because that would make the connection unstable. I need as much surface for that glue joint as possible. So it's sand, roll, next. It's not an onerous process, it's just an awful lot of it. So I'll get through that and then I'll jump into the assembly process. And that's where I'll show you how this jig works and why I made it the way I did. But first, ugh. Unfortunately, royalty issues with music playing and the camera running at the same time cause complications. But you can be pretty confident that as soon as the camera goes off, the iPod goes on. Or I'd fall asleep doing this. Woohoo! The drudgery of sanding is finally over, so I'm going to just go through and sort out these parts so that the 2 halves look good when they're glued together. And I thought that made for a pretty cool visual, this serpentine spectrum of shades from blonde to deep dark orange. But now that they're all kind of in families of colors, I can go through and pair these up and make a selection for which ones are going to go together. What I want to do is pick the ones that are going to go together, these 2 and these 2, and then pair them up like this, but put them in 2 separate piles of matching pairs. And you'll see why when I start assembly. And after a few minutes of sorting, I've got all these pairs here that match up great and a couple of oddballs, but that's bound to happen, and I can just keep these as patterns for future projects. And I'm pleased with how well everything matches up considering the random source for this material. But I'll take a pair of these piles. They're all matched up. The ones across from each other will then be getting glued together. So I'll take those over to the bench. And this is the assembly fixture I made. It's really beefy. It doesn't need to be that strong, but it needs to be accurate. And all I did was assemble some blocks with an internal included angle here of 60 degrees. There's a block underneath here to hold it together. And then a piece in the back allows me to clamp it in a vise. A couple key details of this assembly fixture are the relief slot in the bottom of the V that helps me to align up the points in the gluing process, but there's a little extra space if any excess glue drips out. On the back side of the fixture, you can see a hole in the clamping plate, and that hole just keeps glue squeeze out from building up on the inside of the fixture in use. To use the fixture, all I do is clamp it in a vise to hold it secure at a good working height, so I can place blocks in here when I glue them together. I've got to confess, I have been having one deuce of a time getting a film sequence of gluing these blocks together. I've done all these here with various attempts of shooting that on video, and had every fight in the book, the glue not setting up, misalignment of parts, etc. I guess it's just Murphy's Law as applies to YouTube content producers, because I glued up all of these, close to 30 blocks on my initial go-round, my experimental go-round. No trouble at all with that glue-up fixture. But as soon as I turn that camera on, look out, things are going to fight. But I guess that's a good thing, because I've hashed through a bunch of the difficulties I encountered, and then I came up with a workaround. Basically, I modified my glue-up fixture for accurate, quick, and predictable results. So I'm going to start with a different batch of these matched up blocks and hopefully be able to shoot this sequence without the troubles I've been having. And with any luck, you'll be able to learn from my mistakes and have this part of your project go smooth. I've got 5 matched pairs here, and I can just stack them here on the bench. The left pile, I'm just going to slide to the other side of the vise. And the right pile, I just line up the short points and then give them a spritz with the Starbond CA glue accelerator. So I know that all the blocks on the right have accelerator and they're ready for assembly. I'll be using the thick grade of Starbond CA glue. I really like this stuff. It's a great dispenser bottle with replaceable caps if this one gets plugged up. And for this wood, it's great. The medium, I tried on some other blocks, it's a little too runny. And the thin, which is like water, just soaks into the wood, and there's not enough adhesive left to stick the parts together. You got a glimpse of my assembly fixture before, but it didn't have these 2 parts on it. It was just the open fixture, and I was having difficulty getting the long points to line up in the fixture. So I extended one side of this angle, and then I put a little stop block precisely where the bottom of the leg needs to be when the sharp points of the angle line up. So instead of having to line these 2 pieces up with wet glue and accelerator, I can put the glue on this side, index it to the jig, and then drop the accelerator piece in and get perfect alignment every time. And that's a huge improvement. Although it does require precision in the parts, because initially I don't have a left and a right for these parts, and I'm relying on all of them being precisely the same length. Well, I'm going to hope that this take will actually work. I've got accelerator sprayed on the block on the right, so I'll take thick CA adhesive and put a thick bead along this cut face, and I'm putting it close to that short point heel of this piece, but there's a pretty big glob on there. So now I can just slip this piece into place with this heel lined up right here, tight in that corner, and then drop the other side in. And notice the angle I'm dropping this in. The heels are going to touch first, and then the long point. And what that does is force the excess glue to spread down through that little miter joint and keep it from spooging up here on the inside of the V. I'm putting firm pressure on these pieces against that block. That keeps everything lined up, keeps it from twisting, and keeps the little blocks from rocking. But after 10 seconds, I can pull this out of the fixture. You can see I got a little bit of glue squeeze out here, which is perfect because that means that bead of glue migrated through the joint to cover that whole surface. But I didn't end up with any on the inside short point where I'd have to clean it out. I got a slight bit of misalignment here. There was some fuzz on the face of that cut, and it kept the pieces from lining up, or else I didn't get firm enough pressure towards the back. That's a small enough amount that I'll get away with it, but I can do better. Take another block, make sure there's no fuzz on the face of that wood. Generous bead of Starbond medium or thick CA glue. Drop this piece in place. bring the other piece to bear, and I'm making sure I'm putting extra pressure on those pieces with my thumbs. You can see here where a little bit of excess glue is running out, and it just hangs in that little clearance groove on the bottom, and it doesn't gum up my fixture. If glue spooges out on the back here, it'll just hang in that little hole, and that won't glue up the fixture either. But that's the kind of result I'm after. And with this process and a little practice, it's pretty easy to achieve that level of consistent accuracy. As a side note, the space in between these blocks is exactly 1/8 of an inch, and I've sharpened the tang on a file so I can drag it through that groove and pull out any drips of glue that get down in there in that fixture and would tend to gum it up. And then I also use a sharpened putty knife to keep the indexing surfaces clean, because globs of glue on those surfaces would throw off the accuracy of the glue up as well. And you can see in this test I did on one of my earlier failed attempts, this little bit of CA glue on these cuts is incredibly strong. Wow, that's a strong joint for a dab of glue in 10 seconds. After gluing up over a dozen of the blocks from this production run, I'm feeling like I've come up with a reliable system that I'll use and recommend. The steps in a nutshell are: spray accelerator on one piece, use Starbond thick CA glue, put a generous bead about 1/8 inch away from the short point of this miter cut. Slip the glued piece into the fixture, indexing the heel on the block, drop the accelerated piece in at a steep angle till they touch, and then force it down into the joint. I'm putting firm thumb pressure against the back block and then giving it a good 10 seconds to set. These tropical woods, I think, might have an influence on the cure rate of the CA glue, which is why I think I had some trouble with some of the Padauk pieces that I started off with. But I really like that sequence. I've got no glue squeeze out in the middle here that I have to clean up. I've got a little bit on the face, the edges, and then some squeeze out on the top. But this will get taken care of before the blocks are finished. Woohoo! I've done a fair amount of free advertising for Starbond CA glues and accelerator over the last several months. I've had conversations with Joe at the company about the products and the uses, and our discussions have been about exposing the woodworking community in general to the usefulness and quality of the Starbond products. Starbond CA glues are a lot more familiar to the wood turning community, where the thin product is used as a finish on turned pens, and the wood turning community uses it for finishing small turn projects as well as various inlays and that sort of thing. At some point I'll do a little more in-depth review of the CA products when I do a build video for the little CA glue caddy that you'll see in this video. But I really like the quality and performance of these glues on a project like this. And you can see the usefulness in the cycle rate as I'm gluing these Tsumiki blocks together. Just a small bead of the CA glue is every bit as strong as a coating of regular Titebond type glue when it's clamped for an hour or so. And I get this done in just over 10 seconds. And the cool thing is, it's easy for me to remember back when this kind of glue wasn't even available, and I would have had to come up with a process for gluing these blocks with Titebond and then keeping them clamped for an hour or so. This is a lot of blocks, and that'd be a lot of clamps. Well, that took a little while to get all these blocks glued up, but once I modified the glue up fixture, it went very efficiently, so they're ready for the next step. So it's a pretty tough joint, just like it is, and they'd be plenty good for most activities of stacking the blocks and if they fall on the floor or something. But I took an extra step on these blocks. I see it on other ones, and a spline is put in across the top of the connection, and that just gives it some added strength, plus a little touch of class and craftsmanship. Other blocks have a single spline, but just because I can, I decided to put 2 splines in here. And to do that quickly and safely, it will come as no surprise that I created another fixture to cut the slots for those splines. As you've probably come to expect by now, this fixture is simple to make, it's accurate, it's safe, and it's fast. This fixture has a number of components that you're used to seeing already. It's got a plywood base, could be MDF. It's got a runner that fits in the miter gauge slot on the table. And it's got one of my modified push sticks as a handle for safety. There's 2 chunky V-blocks. They're cut at 30 degrees. And then I put a small vertical cut on here because that allows the pieces to drop down in with a little bit of clearance. You can see this little slot down here. So sawdust won't build up in there, and the sharp point will stick down in there. I put a line on the side of the block here, and that's the maximum size of spline that can get cut in here and not show up on the inside of the V of the block. I took a scrap of wood and cut it exactly to that height so that I can use it for setting the blade height. So that when I use the fixture, you can see the blade come through this slot here, and that cuts a dado for the spline. There's a hole in the back of the fixture here like the other one, and that just makes sure that sawdust or chips don't get into the fixture and throw off the cut. You'll remember these blocks are 2 inches wide, and I decided to place this slot 7/16 of an inch from the back edge of the leg. So it's a 7/16 inch base and then an 1/8 inch slot. I chose that 7/16 spacing just because I like the proportions of where the splines come out on here, but I'll show you the serendipity of that somewhat random decision after a bit. The last thing I did on this fixture was to limit its travel. I want to cut the spline all the way through, but I don't want the fixture to keep going off the back of the table saw. So you can see that this runner extends out the back of the fixture, and then I just clamp a block back here, and that stops the travel of the fixture before it goes too far. And now the fixture only goes as far as I want it. Oh, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but I switched the saw blade out. This is a full 1/8 inch kerf. It happens to be a rip blade, but the important feature is that it's a flat top grind, so it'll make slots with square bottoms. You'll see that play out here in a minute. The fun part is that using this fixture just couldn't be easier. With the saw running, I simply drop a Tsumiki block into the fixture, pushing it up against the vertical fence, run it slowly but smoothly into the blade and back. And then I just flip the block around to put an identically sized kerf in the opposite edge of the block at the same distance from the edge. And I think you'll agree that that is pretty tough to beat. And now I go through the enjoyable routine of cutting over 100 spline slots in 47 Tsumiki blocks pretty effortlessly. And it's pretty amazing how fast I can cut 104 identical splines in 47 blocks. But that goes really well. The important thing is that the slots are all identical in width. So I can make spline material that is just a skosh under 1/8 of an inch that slips down in there, and then glue it in place. I could use any kind of wood for the splines as long as the grain runs horizontally to add strength to the joint, or a darker or lighter color so it shows up as a highlight and a little detail. But in this case, again, just because I could, I decided to use Russian birch plywood. There's, I think there's 11 laminations in here. So when I cut one spline from it, it looks like I cut 11 separate pieces for each of those, which might make like 22 separate pieces for these splines. It's just kind of fun, and it's pretty easy. So I ripped strips 1/8 inch thick off of a piece of that plywood. They're all identically sized, so every one fits in every slot. That would be the same if these were being made with hardwood or some other material. You could use plexiglass, I suppose, for a colored accent. Just an idea. So for this batch of blocks, I need 104 identical splines for all this, and most of you probably know me well enough by now to realize that I'm not going to cut 104 individual splines one at a time, so I'm going to gang cut them out of these strips. They need to be 5/8 wide at the base, so I'm just going to make them 3/4 so they're a little big. I don't have to be so fussy gluing them in. And then I've got another trick up my sleeve for trimming them off flush and making sanding in the end easier. So the first thing I'm going to do is tape together these strips of Russian birch plywood so that I can gang cut them quickly and accurately. I start that by cutting the bundle roughly in half at 30 degrees. And then I can clamp those two separate stacks together in the vise and put a strip of this masking tape on here. Just like that. Same thing on both sides. I'm cutting with the blade right at the long point of that triangle, and that'll make these a generous size that'll make glue up easier. My initial stop fence setup was causing a lot of collateral damage with chipped splines, so I switched to this setup that moved the cutting position farther away from the fence and more down, and then I've got an auxiliary fence here to keep the cutoff pieces from chattering and breaking. And that's a much better, more consistent result. Now I can take the taped bundle and just make alternating 30-degree cuts off the end of this bundle. Since there's 12 strips together, all I need to do is cut 9 piles and I'll have plenty for this batch. But I'll cut a dozen or so just so I don't have to worry about losing or breaking any of these little splines. And just to show I can learn too, I discovered that if I leave just the slightest strip of masking tape on the tip of these blocks, they stay together a lot more predictably than cutting without that tape. Learn something new every day. And with that process, I've easily got over 150 splines, which is great because all I need is 104. But to use these, I just tear them off that piece of tape and then they slip right down into those little spline slots. No trouble at all. Because of the sheer volume of splines that need to be glued in, I worked a little bit on kind of refining the glue up process for putting these little guys in here. And I think I've gotten it to the point where I'll share what I think is a pretty efficient method of doing it. The biggest thing is I'm not using CA glue on this. If I just had a couple and I wanted to do it quickly, I'd use CA glue, but I've got a whole bunch of them, and by the time I get done gluing the last one, the first one will be dry enough to work with. So I'll show you that process. It starts at the bench with Titebond 2 glue. I'm just putting it in a little disposable cup here, get a little puddle going, and typically I use Titebond 3, but Titebond 2 is a little thicker and it works better for this process. The next thing I have is some guy glitter, aka fine sawdust, in a cup, and then I have a bunch of these little splines that I've released from the masking tape that was used for cutting them. And I'm doing the glue up process at the bench where I can just clamp these blocks in a vise to hold them while I glue the splines in. And last but not least, this Titebond glue brush. And I'm just using this little spatula end for this process. I've also got a 3/4 inch putty knife that's sharp, a paper towel, and some patience. The process is pretty simple. I just take one of these splines and I'm going to be gluing them in with the long direction of this grain going across the joint. That'll make it the strongest in there. But I basically just take one of these little splines, take the spatula and spatule a little glue on the block, and then slip it down in the slot. Just kind of work it around a little bit to make sure there's glue on all the surfaces. And I do that with both splines. Some splines are just slightly tighter than others, but as long as they're snug in that slot with enough glue to fill the gaps, it's good to go. Once I've got the splines in there, I just twist this around in that sawdust that gets absorbed into the glue squeeze out. And I set these aside for a few minutes while that glue kind of gels. I can do this pretty quick and easy with this system, making sure that I'm comfortable with the amount of glue down inside there. I want all that wood primed so these little guys stick, especially because they're made up of all these little pieces of wood, and I don't want these things splintering out later when I go to smooth them off. But this little spatula works pretty slick for this process. My splines could have been ever so slightly thicker, so I'm using a little more glue to make sure they're snug in those slots. But the sawdust soaks up in that extra glue real quick and easy. I know that the slots are all identical in width, so any variance in how tight the pieces fit has got to do with the thickness of the piece. There's a snug one there. There's a variance of a few thousandths of an inch in thickness on those long plywood strips. This one's loose, that one's tight, but both are just fine. After the glue has a few minutes to set and gel, these blocks are pretty firm in place. I just take that putty knife and kind of wipe that excess glue and sawdust off of here. I don't have to get it 100%, but as long as I get the big chunks, it saves a little bit of trouble later on. And that's all there is to it. And even 104 splines doesn't take all that long to get in place. But now you're wondering, what do I do with this excess block sticking out of here? Everybody knows I hate sanding, so I hope you trust me to have a quick and easy solution for flushing this up. And I do. I'll be the first to admit that the flush trimming fixture I came up with for trimming off these splines so they're flush with the blocks is a little bit radical. But follow along and I think you'll see how well it works. I'm starting off with a piece of 1/4" MDF material. I cut a 45-degree angle on one end, and then I drew a center line and then 2 lines that are each an inch away from that center line, and that centers up the block on this strip. Now I position a block with those lugs about a 1/4 inch ahead of that leading edge and center it up between my pencil marks. Then I mark the location of the V in the legs. I'll spray a little CA glue activator on that triangle, reposition the legs there, and then I'll put a dab of thick CA glue on one of the little leg notch scrap pieces from earlier, and then CA glue that into place. And then I'll just glue another one of these spare legs back here. The reason I'm using these pieces is that they're identical in thickness to the legs. And I'm leaving a little bit of a gap between the workpiece and this block on the fixture. Next, I've taken just another block of wood, used the Forstner bit to drill a couple of relief finger holes in it, and that way I can place this block on the fixture to hold the workpiece as I'm doing the flush trim process. And I can mark the location of this on that block. Now I can spray CA glue activator on the bottom of that block, add a dab of CA glue here, and a couple of strips on this piece. Then I can line up my little mark there and glue this top block down. Now I'll drill through with a small snappy bit, and then I can drive a brass screw down into that pilot hole. And man, these cordless screwdrivers just aren't what they're cracked up to be. But that brass screw acts as a fail-safe in this fixture in case it gets bumped. I don't want this to snap off during use. And now I can just slip a block that needs to be flush trimmed into this fixture. The little leg V kind of keeps it from moving around, and a little bit of finger pressure here holds it in place. I've removed the guard from my joiner to show how I set this fixture up, but I'll put it back on during use. For the proper setup, I want to line up the outfeed table with the top of this 1/4 inch fixture here. So I just lower the infeed table until both of these surfaces are lined up perfectly, and then lock the table down. So now, with the workpiece in place in this fixture and the joiner running, I just feed this through until those lugs are planed off flush with the outfeed table, with the top of the fixture, and thereby the face of this leg of the block. Simple as that. The spooky part is, to use this, I need to run the workpiece in until those lugs are planed off. That puts my fingers mighty close to that cutter head, but I'm comfortable doing it because it doesn't require any force for the operation. I'll do this once for the video with the blade guard removed, and then put it back in place for the remainder of the cuts. And that's all there is to it. The blocks are trimmed up nice and flush, so all I need now is a little bit of sanding to finish the job. I want to tell you about an edit I made to this flush trimming fixture. After doing a half a dozen or so of these blocks, I was getting uncomfortable with the fact that the legs were pretty loose in the fixture, and I had to add extra finger pressure when I was doing the flush trimming process. And that's because the pieces inside are the same thickness of the legs, so it's kind of a loose fit. And for my fixture, a single layer of masking tape was all it took to add just that little bit of extra pressure to make the jig more comfortable to use on a long-term basis. And with that slight modification, the pieces are held securely in the fixture, and I can keep my hand farther back for increased safety during this operation. When the cutter guard's in place, it still needs to be pivoted out of the way when the actual cut is being made, but it protects the cutter head the remainder of the time. And notice here, for this flush trimming process, I just advance the block over the cutter head until the point of the block reaches the outfeed table. That way I know that the spline is trimmed completely flush. Once the splines are trimmed flush, I finish up these blocks with a little bit of sanding. I don't care much for sanding, but with the process I've used for making these blocks, very little is required for a fantastic finish. I just clamp the block in the vise so it's a little bit above the jaws, and then I take one of these belt sanding blocks for this bit of sanding. I did a video called Best Blocks for Demanding Sanding that shows you how you can make a block like this of your own, which you'll probably want to do once you see how great this works. There's a little bit of roughness here on these two splines after it comes out of the joiner, and there's a little bit of glue squeeze out along this point. But neither one of those is a problem. Using this stiff block with sharp 100 grit sandpaper, I use it almost like a file to smooth this off. And a few licks like that gets that very smooth. Then I use that gator block with the 220 grit sandpaper to finish it off. And that's all it takes for a perfectly flush, smooth finish. Once the two faces are done, I'll use the gator block with 220 grit sandpaper to smooth up the edges and remove any glue squeeze up from the miter. And then I roll the two corners so that the top and the bottom match. Last but not least, I'll remove the razor edge from the top of the miter. But that only takes a few licks of that sandpaper. I spent the last couple hours out here in the shop finishing up these blocks, getting everything all cut up, glued the splines in, modified that flush trimming jig, finished flush trimming these, and then developed a sanding process. I showed sanding earlier, but after doing 40 of these, I've gotten the system dialed. I timed a couple of them, and I got them in under a minute and 10 seconds to sand these. And in the process, it dawned on me that 47 and 47 does not equal 104. But anyways, the process I came up with involves these tools here, the record vise, a 100 grit best block for demanding sanding, 220 grit on a gator block, and then 150 grit on a best blocks for demanding sanding. And with this little setup here, I can crank through these pretty quick with the process. 100 grit on the block, sand till the glue and everything is gone off of there. Chase it with the 220, flip it over, grab the block like this with the V pointing away from me, drop it on this 150 grit, give it a few swipes to smooth up those faces, back to the 220, sand a face, roll the outside edge, roll the inside edge, roll the inside edge, roll the outside edge, a backhanded placement of the block, sand the top, sand the other face, roll the outside edge, roll the inside edge, roll the inside edge, roll the outside edge, touch up and done. And I kind of developed that process because I hate sanding and I had all these to do, but when I got it dialed in, it actually went pretty fast. With the iPod going, it wasn't too bad. I think I already mentioned it. There'll be a link to these demanding sanding blocks. In the video description, I'll include all the other tools and supplies I used in the video in that description as well. But I wanted to point out the difference between the sanding blocks I'm using. This block with rough paper doesn't do that job. That block with smooth paper doesn't do this job. But a combination of them really makes this process cruise and makes a burdensome task somewhat less unpleasant. And I'm going to call that done. 42 blocks and 84 legs, regardless of everything I said earlier with my mathematical accuracy oversight. Well, I wasn't planning on doing this, but after all that sanding, I decided to give all these blocks a coat of beeswax to bring out the color and kind of capitalize on the time I spent sanding and spiffing them up. If you've never had a chance to use beeswax, it's some pretty cool stuff, and this is a good project for it because it gets in and out of all the tight angles. It's easy to put on, it's easy to take off. It's not a chemical, so it's pretty user-friendly. Plus, it really brings out some nice colors from the wood. I'm using Skidmore's beeswax. I got it many years ago. I'm not even sure how the stuff is sold now. I think maybe it comes in quart cans or quart jugs or something, but a great product. and it's pretty much foolproof to apply. So I'm going to do this for a while, and I'll catch back up after I'm done with this process so you can see what some blocks made out of ugly old pallets can look like. Well, this is what 42 Tsumiki blocks made from exotic pallet woods look like when sanded smooth, shined up with the luster of a beeswax finish, stacked into a simple tiered structure, and, most importantly, professionally photographed by my longtime friend Johnny at Johnny's Sunbeam Studio in Rapid City. Thanks, buddy. You definitely did a next level job of capturing these Tsumiki images for this video, which I really appreciate. Early in the video, I mentioned a serendipity when I was laying out and cutting the spline notches in the tops of these blocks. Well, now is later, and here's the serendipity. These splines are laid out 7/16 inch in from the edge of the blocks, and they're an 1/8 inch wide. And I just picked out that dimension because I like the proportion. But the serendipity is that when the blocks are stacked, the splines just disappear when a second layer of blocks is stacked and centered up on the block below. And I don't know if I ever would have thought to plan them that way, because it works so perfectly for making even structures. And I sincerely want to congratulate all 7 of you viewers who made it through to the end of this epic step-by-step build video. Not a task for the faint of heart, to be sure. And I want to thank the growing list of patrons who've gone above and beyond to help support production of in-depth build videos like this one. Just so you know, I spent most of my free time for over a week building this video from nearly 150 individual video, still, and audio files. Your generous pledges are helping to offset income I don't earn on my day job when I spend all those hours planning, shooting, and editing all that media into a video. There's a link to Patreon in the video description where anyone inclined to join this list of dedicated viewers can make a pledge that goes a long way towards my goal of taking Next Level Carpentry to its own next level, making it a vibrant, self-supporting channel offering content beyond typical DIY methods, ideas, and projects. And with your contribution, I really believe that the best of Next Level Carpentry is yet to come. I hope many of you are inspired by this video to take your abilities to your own next level and make some Tsumiki for yourself or for someone who will cherish them. For now, as always, thanks for watching.